There we
Thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, before our break, we were knee deep into the story. The South Africans have been told by a clandestine CIA source that he has first-hand knowledge that an attack on Southwest Africa is in process of being planned. Forces are being put together. These forces will launch from Zambia, roughly a battalion's strength, and they'll either be air-landed or dropped by parachute onto an airfield within Southwest Africa. The purpose being that they take over the airfield, more reinforcements come in, and it will flying journalists, flying the press, flying everybody like that, and use it as a massive propaganda and try and force the Africa's hand in this negotiations about what to do, what they're going to do about Southwest Africa. The General Office Commanding of Joint Combat Forces at that stage is Charles Pop Fraser. When he hears about this, he drafts the first operational orders that the SADF will actually ever use, where he calls for the reinforcement of various identified airfields across Southwest Africa. And this reinforcement mission will get a very strange name. I have no idea how they actually come up with it, but the operation will be codenamed Dikmelk, in English curdled milk. Really weird, really strange way of describing the operation, but that is how it plays out. The South African Defence Force appreciates that the possible targets for this airborne or paratrooper assault airfield, in probability, they think that Katima Mulilo is the most likely, then Rundu, Ndangwa, Grootfontein, Tsumeb, Windhoek, or Ruakana. And those are the airfields that they feel that are the most vulnerable and the ones that, if there's an attack that have been taking place, that Katima Mulilo, closest to Zambia, just over the border, very isolated, easy to get to, very, very vulnerable. The Dikmelk's aim is as follows. If we look at the order drafted by Bob Fraser, is firstly, if UN forces were to land their troops, then by use of force, the SADF had to prevent the landings from ever taking place by erecting barriers, and if the aircraft was in range of their weapons, to engage these aircraft as they flew over. If they were to use paratroopers, exactly the same thing, engage the paratroopers while they're in the air, and as they hit the ground, use force to repel any such assault against any airfield within the territory of Southwest Africa. From the Air Force's side, number one squadron, a flight of 6 Sabre aircraft is immediately dispatched to Grootfontein to provide air cover over the northern parts of Southwest Africa as an air defense measure. Number 5 Buccaneers and Canberra strike aircraft, even the Shackleton Marine aircraft, are all placed on standby. That is literally the entire South African Air Force's frontline fleet is then put on standby for military operations in northern Namibia. Out of the South African Army's perspective, to defend these airfields, the Anti-Aircraft Training Center, today the Anti-Aircraft Air Defense Academy or Training Center, it's then still based in Brakpan, they're on the East Rand, and they are told to prepare 34 of the 35mm Olicon cannons, along with 2 of the Fledermaus radar systems, which will be loaded immediately by C-130s and transported to Walfish Bay, the South African enclave in Southwest Africa, for deployment further into northern Southwest Africa. There you can quickly see the picture of the Sabre fighter aircraft that are flown to Grootfontein to provide air superiority over the northern areas of Southwest. On 8 December, B Company, a 1 parachute battalion in Bloemfontein, is activated. National servicemen, if you can recall, in the 1960s, National Service worked as follows. It was not a universal call-up yet. It was on a lottery-based system. So everybody that was eligible entered into a lottery, and if your name was drawn, then you would go and do National Service. Your National Service was only for 9 months. So B Company is a National Service, because this is now December. They've almost finished their obligatory 9 months training. They're about to be disbanded and go back to civilian street. So they are at the real edge of their military service. They are activated. They're 120 men strong. They're picked up in Bloemfontein, and they are immediately taken to JG Stadium Airport in Windhoek by C-130 and told, this is your objective. Keep this major airport, the capital city of Windhoek, also a primary target for United Nations. If they do intend to assault, this is your responsibility. And to support them, the first armor from a South African perspective is also deployed. A troop of 4 armored cars of the panels that have just come into South Africa from France, 2 VA-90s and 2 VA-60s are dispatched from Tusai and Walvis Bay and told to also deploy to the JG Stratham Airport. But the airport is still being used by commercial flights, and the Africans don't want to show what they're doing. So these crews are told to move into the airport at night and camouflage their vehicles. Be on close standby. If in case something happens, that you can deploy quickly onto the tarmac to engage aircraft, to engage paratroopers coming down, but generally it's to stay undercover, that remain hidden until you actually are required to act. The South African Defence Force is very fortunate in the sense that at that stage, purely by luck, Regiment Noord-Transvaal is a citizen force unit. They have called up their entire regiment for a training exercise, and they are currently on the training area when the story takes place. And because they're already been called up, they're already under arms, they're already busy with training, they are immediately switched from a training mission to an operational mission. And the first company from Regiment Noord-Transvaal is picked up there in their training area, which is there at Pietersburg, today Polokwane, and they are flown directly to Walvis Bay as a reserve for the operation. 10 December comes and 10 December goes, and no United Nations forces arrive to disturb the peace in South Africa. But the South Africans are not going to relax. They still suspect that something could happen, particularly the new commander of South Africa Command, Brigadier General Magnus Malan. He feels that there is still a very real danger to Southwest Africa. And according to the document coming out of his headquarters, various enemy actions are still possible. And he lists these actions as he sees them. Firstly, a possible peaceful penetration of Southwest Africa, by air by a group of approximately 200 personnel, possibly coming in on a civilian airliner. Once they land, demonstrators, the press, everybody rushing out onto the airfield, photographs, that type of thing. Second one, an air attack by 1 or 2 aircraft against a very isolated target, or even an air assault to capture at a strategic airfield. And the thinking always returns to Katimu because it's so isolated, close to Zambia. They feel that is really a danger area for them. So Milan orders that all the forces that are available should be deployed still into northern Southwest Africa to be able to neutralize any of these forces. He feels, however, that the most likely target for scenario 1, this commercial airliner, is JG Stratham Airport outside Windhoek, and the most likely airfield for scenarios 2 or 3 will be Katimu. And those 2 airfields, he feels, should be defended immediately as best as what the South Africans at that current stage are able to do. Joint Combat Force Headquarters agrees, and they feel that a show of force will be appropriate to send a warning to any potential aggressor that landing in Southwest will be met by force. So the SADF decides to airlift reinforcements into the area. Firstly, that one recommended Noord-Transvaal company that's been on standby at Walvis Bay is picked up, and they are transported by air to Katimu to garrison Katimu the airfield at Mapacha. Then 2 other companies from Tusai, also national servicemen that are just about to finish up their tour of duty. They are also picked up, and they are sent to garrison the airfield at Rundu and the garrison the airfield at Ndangwa. And lastly, the C-130s fly back to South Africa and pick up 2 additional companies of Regiment Noord-Transvaal who have now completed their training and were preparing actually to go home. They now picked up in Pietersburg and flown to garrison Tsumeb and Grootfontein. So there are 3 companies of Regiment Noord-Transvaal on 3 different airfields, and 2 companies from Tusai on 2 different airfields. So 5 of the identified airfields have now got at least a company-sized strength military unit defending the airport and its environments, with orders to shoot, to kill if anybody tries to land, air assault, paratrooper assault on any of these airfields. And these are the first real deployments of the SADF into this area. It is not well known, but this is the first time that these operational orders are given to national servicemen of the SADF era. And for that alone, Operation Dikmelk is historically important for us as military historians. Like I already mentioned, the 1967 intake is a 9-month intake, and their service is about to end in December. And this causes obviously a lot of problems for the SNDF because a lot of these youngsters have got commitments. They have made their mind. They're going to university next year. They've got to do their lives to go over. And what now? How long do you keep them to guard these airports? How long is it before it's deemed safe that the UN has tried and has started to back down? And that is the decision that the SNDF upper echelons have to take. And they hold out as long as possible. And if you look and see the correspondence, obviously there's parents that are upset. Where are their children? Where are their sons? They're supposed to be home. It's almost Christmas. Their military service is done. Why aren't they home? Because this entire mission has been classified top secret. Nobody in South Africa knows about it. Nobody in Namibia knows about it. Only people that know about it are members that are actually within the inner SADF or the youngsters that are actually deployed. So total secrecy clamped down on the entire movement, the entire operation. By the 22nd of December, the SANDF feels, okay, the threat has passed sufficiently enough to allow all these national servicemen to go home. They clear out during the night, that they get back to Walfish Bay by the 23rd, that they can climb onto their trains, their special troop trains, those who remember the border war era, special troop trains, while in South Africa still had a functioning railway system, that are waiting for them. And these youngsters basically climb off the plane, they rush through a demobilization scenario, hand back the equipment, jump onto their trains and go back. Those who are heading to Johannesburg are fortunate. Their train arrives in Johannesburg on the 24th, so they make it home for Christmas. Those who are going to Cape Town, however, are not that lucky. Their train will only arrive in Cape Town at 4 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Day, because all the trains go to the R, at the railway junction of the R, and from there it splits. Those trains that are going to Johannesburg tend to up north, and those going down to the coast obviously tend to the south. Now, the question is, did the SANDF overreact to a non-existent threat? Because based on the information that the SADF had, they had the Vice report, they had signal intercepts, and they had this clandestine CIA sources walking in. But did they read the situation wrong? And while I was researching this, I came across this little interesting little newspaper article that appeared in the Rand Daily Mail that made me think, interesting. Zambia's ambassador to the United Nations, Mr. Mwanga, said the following: evasive and ineffective responses to this African challenge in Southwest Africa. He's criticizing the United Nations quite heavily during the assembly. He says, and he calls for enforced measures to the Security Council, the African administration, and to permit the United Nations to take control of the territory and lead it to independence. It labels Africa as international gangsterism, and he calls that the United Nations have no other option but to bring the racist regime to heel. So this gives you an idea of how the Zambians were thinking about it. Now, the potential forming up place, assembly area for this was in Zambia. So this is how the politicians in Zambia, the rhetoric, the wording that he uses, just makes me pause and wonder how real this threat was. And I think that I'm still looking for further corroborating evidence, but my personal feelings was that there was a little bit of a threat involved here. But because of the rapid deployment of the SADF to these airfields, the UN actually backs down. If the SADF had not rapidly deployed their companies to these areas, maybe there was a threat. Maybe there was, the United Nations was seriously considering launching an air assault to force the issue in South Africa. We will never know. But I'm still searching through the archives for better sources. But these little bits and pieces of the puzzle that I have found already are lending me to lean towards that there was a credible threat to Southwest Africa posed by the United Nations. That being said, the threat passes. And the African Defence Force has pulled all its forces back to its bases, and it's back to the normal counterinsurgency operations against SWA. But South Africa is now, the South African Defence Force has now experienced this first operational deployment into Namibia, and they realize that the counterinsurgency campaign against SWA is not going away. And the little limited assistance that they've given the South African police is not sufficient. They're going to have to increase their commitment to counterinsurgency operations in northern Namibia quite drastically. So in April 1969, they decided to permanently start sending helicopters and their crews to northern Namibia. And negotiations between South Africa and Portugal have progressed to such a stage by 1968 that the Portuguese have given permission for the African helicopters to fly into Portugal and assist. The Africans have been offering and offering to help the Portuguese, and the Portuguese eventually say, yes, we need help. We don't have enough soldiers. Southeast Angola is absolutely undefended at the moment. But if you want to, if you will provide the helicopters, we will provide the soldiers, and that is basically the agreement that has taken place. The Africans will provide Alouette helicopters for troop carrying responsibilities, and the Portuguese will provide the soldiers to go out and do the work on the ground. So on the 16th of April 1968, the first operational South African Air Force flight. Now, this is under South African Air Force colors, no longer under the South African police. Actually flies into Angola to do a reconnaissance of all the airfields in Southeast Angola, what airfields are available, what are their tarmacs like, where can logistics land, all those type of things. The reconnaissance mission lasts for 3 days, and it starts in Makuso, which is on the Namibian Southwest Africa border, and flies north and includes stops at Santa Cruz do Quando, on the DRC border today, at Derinkwa, where the police had already been to, at Cargo Guntino, at Kitokonavale, before they return to Rundu and their major base at Rundu. The African cabinet has been asked by the Portuguese, can you help provide arms and ammunition for us? Because of the NATO restrictions that Portugal's faced, they cannot use any of their arms that are purchased by NATO in their colonies. So in April 68, the South African cabinet decides to give the Portuguese armed forces 3 of the brand new Alouettes that we've just bought from the French, and 33 of the brand new Panhard armor cars that we also just bought from the French. Give it to them to be able to use in their colonies and thereby bypass these NATO restrictions. The African Air Force also decides that they are going to permanently station in northern Southwest Africa 8 of these Alouette 3s and 3 of the Cessna 185s will deploy to the airfield at Rundu and the Kivutimumulilo on a permanent basis now. There will be no longer shifting and chopping around. These aircraft will be permanently now stationed in Southwest Africa for the foreseeable future. And that foreseeable future will last for almost 27 years, which we all know. But to command and control this movement of helicopters into Angola and out, and because the South African Air Force is now got, they're assisting 2 separate organizations. They still have a responsibility to assist the South African police with their counterinsurgency operations within Southwest Africa, but they now also have a responsibility to assist the Portuguese armed forces within Southeastern Angola. So all this arrangement forms under a single headquarters, and they set up a joint air support center in Kitokonavale, where all requests from the Portuguese armed forces for helicopter assistance or flight assistance of any nature, including logistics from Dakotas and all that type of flights, will come to this joint air support center. And from there, it will come to South Africa, where they can then decide how they can help, what they can and what they can't do. So this is the beginning of a very formal relationship between the South African military and the Portuguese armed forces, where we have South African military officers serving in this Portuguese headquarters, this joint support center inside Kitokonavale. There you can see the area we're talking about, that first flight that Lieutenant Wilkins flies. There you can see his flight path, and you can see that we're concentrating particularly on southeastern Angola, the land beyond time. There's no infrastructure. There's really nothing there. The the only way to get around from point A to B is literally by helicopter. To command and control both the police and the Portuguese air requests, the South African Air Force establishes one air component in Rundu. And the first officer commanding is Lieutenant Colonel Larry Eager, who is a World War II and a Korean War veteran. And this headquarters will comprise of approximately 60 men. And this is the first real South African Defence Force mission organization unit set up in North and Southwest Africa. Now, you must recall that even though it was not illegal, the mandate that Africa got from the United Nations originally did not allow for the deployment of military forces into the territory of Southwest Africa. That is why the South Africans are so reluctant to deploy a lot of the time. That's why the mission is falling under the police's command and control and not the SADF, because there is this, even today within our current constitution, the South African National Defence Force of today needs specific approval by cabinet to be able to deploy within South Africa. All militaries have a very outward-looking, defend the borders against external aggression. It's frowned upon to have your military deploy inside your own country, to do operations inside your own country. That is the domain of the South African police, not the South African Defence Force. So this is a very historically important point, that the establishment of one air component within South Africa, a unit operational within the operational area, is now being established. A logistics railhead is also established at Grootfontein. That is where the railway line ends. And from then on, from Grootfontein north to Rundu, and there will be road convoys bringing all the logistics that will be required. The area north of latitude 20 degrees is now declared an operational area. This is to ensure the legality of SADF operations. Now, if you look on the map on your right-hand side, that's that light green area that covers the whole part of northern Namibia. Now that becomes classified as an operational area, thereby allowing the SADF to be able to deploy into this area without any legal limitations attached to their deployments. By June of 1968, the first Air Force missions are already going into Angola to assist the Portuguese armed forces. They are limited to reconnaissance, troop carrying, casevac, logistics, and liaison flights. At that stage, the first helicopters going in, the Alouettes, are unarmed. It will later change because the Portuguese are regularly arming their Alouettes. The Portuguese also have Alouettes. We gave them some, and the first thing the Portuguese do is they put on machine guns onto their Alouettes. They call them gunships, but South Africa is reluctant to go so offensive first. So we are doing a very much a supporting role over the first 2 years of, and then this is called Operation Bombay. Sorry, the Africa's support to Portugal is Operation Bombay, and in Portuguese, Bombeam. The Portuguese are, however, very fearful that their relations with South Africa will become well known. So there are a lot of restrictions placed on South African pilots, South African crews operating in Portuguese-controlled Angola. For instance, no national markings on the aircraft. So the only way that you could tell that the Alouettes came from South Africa was that the numbering 9322 to 9329 were the 8 helicopters that were stationed in Southwest that were used predominantly by the Portuguese. The crews would wear Portuguese uniforms and would be clandestine in its ways. Similarly, the Portuguese helicopters also would not have national markings, that only just have numbers. So to a casual observer who happened to see these helicopters, there would be no way to tell the difference between which Alouettes were Portuguese Alouettes and which ones were South African Air Force helicopters. The only way was by the numbering, if you happen to know what the numbering was. These 8 Alouettes are divided. 6 are placed at Rundu and 2 are placed at Kitimu-Malilu on a permanent basis, and that will become their home units for all intents and purposes for the next 25 years or so. By the end of June, the seconding of South African Air Force personnel to the South African Police is also cancelled. The African Air Force is now taking control of its own assets and will now command and control its own assets, and the police, same as the Portuguese, will have to come to the joint center, put in their requests like everybody else, and then the missions will flow from there. The Air Force deploys to Rundu and it deploys to Katima Malilu. But they really realize how isolated these two airfields actually are. And they are quite concerned because their machines are parked out in the open. There's no underground, there's no covering for these aircraft, there's no defensive positions. And they immediately start asking the Commandant General of the SADF, we need ground forces to protect these airfields. And very small initially. Only a single platoon is sent to Runtu and a single platoon is sent to Kadimu Malilu. But this is the first deployment of the South African Army officially into Northern Southwest Africa. It's the protection of these two airfields. Now, those of you who come from the Signal Corps know that the signalers had clandestinely already moved into Northern Southwest Africa as part of Operation Brush to establish electronics warfare listening stations. But these gentlemen were still in mufti, in civilian clothes. It was a clandestine operation. While this deployment is in full uniform, everybody can see that this is the South African Defence Force that has taken over control over these two isolated airfields. This will quickly grow from one platoon. Eventually, before the end of the year, both will be upgraded to a company-sized strength, including the introduction of armor, particularly the panel armor cars, will also be going firstly to Katimu Malilu because of its isolated nature to come and protect these airfields from any possible threat. There you can see on the little map at the bottom that the MPLA was predominantly, you can see on the map, they were predominantly infiltrating into the central part of Angola, while UNITA was heading for that southeastern corner, and SWAPO was piggybacking on the back of both these organizations and infiltrating through that southeastern corridor to be able to reach Ubambaland, there opposite Oshakati. So this was the tactical situations the South Africans and the Portuguese armed forces were faced with. These three organizations infiltrating via Zambia through a terrain that's got no infrastructure whatsoever and trying to be able to control such an insurgency. On the 20th of June, first air component at Rundu becomes operational, and very quickly, 2,500 pounds of freight are required by the Portuguese armed forces every day. The South Africans are providing a lot of the logistics, a lot of the ammunition, a lot of the fuel. Obviously, some of it is being repaid, some of it is on free loan. On the 1st of July, one airbase unit is established at Rundu. Now, between July and September, there's a document in the Defense Archives that just gives you a basic breakdown of what the South African Air Force is doing in these first few months that they are deployed into Angola. They fly 406 operational flight hours. During this, they are launching almost daily missions into Angola. 317 people are killed, including women and children. 284 are captured, and they are able to recover 2 Smirnoff semi-automatic rifles, 3 rifles of unknown origin, a 9mm HMK, a barrel for a light machine gun, hand grenades, rounds, uniforms, documents, and medical supplies. That is the first tour of duty that the South African Air Force goes to. These are the successes that they obtained. There is obviously a need to protect these airfields. And there you can see by October of 1968, one rifle company, along with mortars, have now been deployed at Kibatimu Malilu. A troop of panel armor cars has been flown by C-130 from one special service battalion in Bloemfontein and deployed by the C-130s also to Katima. By December, Rundu is exactly the same. They've also been upgraded from their platoon to their rifle company with armored cars. And by January, the first of the units outside Southwest, not 2 SAI, in other words, are deployed. 3 SAI from Potchefstroom will be the first of the South African-based units to start going through a tour of duty in the northern border. And this will be a continuous tour of duty for the next 27 years. All the different infantry battalions of the SADF will eventually get a turn to go into these deployment areas, specifically into Rundu and specifically into Katima Malilu. You see on the right, that's typically the document that I work with when I go through the archives. Now, this is just a SITREP of a single 5-day rough period. And you can look and see these are the type of scenario that the Africans are facing every day. On the 5th of December, SITREP number 32, all that it says is during Operation Muwe, the South Africans picked up 32 Portuguese troops and they landed them. The Portuguese burned down huts, food, clothing, and destroyed cattle. 2 men, 4 women, and 3 children were captured. 1 rifle was captured during the operation. And then there's a side note: a Portuguese patrol returning from Muye was ambushed by 20 terrorists. 1 of the Portuguese soldiers were killed and 6 were wounded. On SITREP number 33 of 11 December, the Africans with 5 helicopters launched Operation Cargo Continuo, and during the operation, 1 terrorist was killed and his weapon was recovered. Ops Kangama from the 6th or 7th of December 1968, again 32 Portuguese troops are landed. The military start drawing long distance fire. This fire is returned and a terrorist is killed. Again, huts, crops are destroyed. 4 women, 4 children are evacuated. More long-distance fire is drawn by the Portuguese. They again return fire, killing 6 terrorists. More huts, crops are destroyed. The Alouette helicopters, a helicopter of the Alouettes also captures 2 of the women. The Portuguese are trying to control the population. They understand that SWAPO, MPLA, UNITA are using the population. So that's why you can see in that says there that they evacuate the population. They are moving them into what they call concentrados. It is an armed camp. They are moving everybody out of the rural areas, out of the countryside, and putting them into these camps to try and prevent them providing assistance to any one of the terrorist organizations. And last, you can see at the bottom, Alto Quito, one of the more successful operations launched during this basic week and a half. 10 terrorists were killed, 3 camps were destroyed, and a terrorist observation post was destroyed, along with the 4 terrorists that are manning it. And again, at the end of the operation, another terrorist was killed and the camp was effectively destroyed. And that's typically just a 1 sheet of paper within the military archives describing a simple week that is taking place in 1968 in Angola. In conclusion for tonight, ladies and gentlemen, throughout the next year, 1969, the South African Air Force's Alouette 3s will continue to operate almost daily in collaboration with the Portuguese Armed Forces, and will continue to launch almost weekly operations across Southeast Africa like the one we've just seen. This close cooperation will eventually lead to the establishment of a formal security agreement, which will be known as the Alcora exercise, which will involve South Africa, Rhodesia, and Portugal. And that is the next step in, like I told you at the beginning of tonight's talk, that we are, when I say we, a bunch of us academics are actually investigating this Alcora exercise. I'm responsible for the first part. And this is a very maligned part of South African military history. Not a lot is known about it, and I'm been brilliantly surprised to find all the information available as I've gone through my research covering this, the early 66 to 69 period. Thank you very much. I hope that was okay.